The executioner doesn't hold an axe. He holds a pair of red-hot iron pincers. In the field outside Munich, the crowd of 10,000 falls silent. They know this will not be a swift death. On the scaffold, a woman named Anna Pappenheimer kneels, her body already broken from days of torture. Her final agony is being forced to see her 2 adult sons chained to nearby posts. Watch what comes next. The executioner reaches for her chest. The pincers close. The sound that rips through the silence isn't a scream, but something worse. The sound of a soul realizing that mercy has completely abandoned this world. This was never about justice. It was a public spectacle of cruelty, a warning written in scorched flesh to terrorize a nation. This level of orchestrated cruelty doesn't just happen. It has to be built, piece by agonizing piece. To understand how one ordinary family, the Pappenheimers, could become the centerpiece of Germany's most infamous witch trial, we must uncover the political conspiracy that demanded not just their deaths, but their absolute obliteration. Before we delve into our story, I invite you to subscribe to the channel. It is the surest way to join us for every future exploration into the forgotten corners of the past. The story of the Pappenheimer family begins with the dead. In the small Bavarian town where Anna grew up, her father was the man everyone needed but nobody wanted to see. He was the gravedigger, the one who handled corpses, who touched death with his bare hands. In a world where superstition ran deeper than faith, this made him and his entire family permanently unclean. Picture young Anna, maybe 6 or 7 years old, walking through the market square. The other children scatter like she carries plague. Mothers pull their little ones close, whispering prayers of protection. The baker refuses to hand her bread directly, instead dropping it on the counter and stepping back. This is what it means to be born into shadow, to be marked from birth as something less than human. Here's the thing about social isolation. It creates its own gravity. The outcasts find each other, and that's exactly what happened when Anna met Paulus. He was another pariah, another soul marked by his father's profession. His family cleaned sewers, handled waste, did the jobs that kept society functioning but that society despised them for doing. Their marriage wasn't just love, though by all accounts, genuine affection existed between them. It was survival. 2 people who understood what it meant to be permanently outside, permanently other. When they stood before the priest, when they made their vows, they were creating more than a union. They were building a fortress of 2 against a world that had already rejected them. The early years brought children, first Simon, then little Gumprecht, and finally the youngest, Michel. With each birth, Anna and Paulus must have felt that mix of joy and dread that comes with bringing new life into a hostile world. These weren't just their children. These were more souls born into the shadow, more lives that would carry the stain of their parents' untouchable status. And this is where the tragedy really begins to take shape, because being poor in Bavaria at the turn of the 17th century was dangerous enough. The 30 Years' War was brewing. Religious tensions crackled through every town and village. Fear hung in the air like smoke. But being poor and ritually unclean, being the family that everyone already associated with death and filth, that combination would prove catastrophic. The Pappenheimers tried to build a life. Paulus took whatever work he could find, fixing things, hauling loads, anything that didn't require social acceptance. Anna raised the children, teaching them to keep their heads down, to be invisible, to survive. They moved frequently, always on the margins, always one step ahead of complete destitution. But isolation breeds suspicion. When you're already seen as tainted, every misfortune in the community starts to bend toward you. A cow dies unexpectedly. People remember that the gravedigger's daughter walked past that field. A well runs dry. Someone recalls seeing Paulus near it the week before. These weren't accusations yet, just whispers, glances, the slow accumulation of unease that would eventually crystallize into something monstrous. The family scraped by for years this way, existing in the spaces between legitimate society. They lived in ramshackle quarters on the edges of towns, in the areas where nobody else wanted to be. They were Bavaria's invisible people, necessary but despised, human but not quite human enough. And here's what makes their story so heartbreaking. They were just trying to live. In all the records, in all the accounts, there's no evidence of any wrongdoing beyond the crime of poverty and the misfortune of birth. They were a family like any other, with parents who loved their children, and children who trusted their parents. They shared meals, told stories, faced hardships together. The social death sentence passed on them at birth. That should have been tragedy enough. It should have been their only burden. But in Bavaria, in 1600, being an outcast wasn't just uncomfortable or limiting. It was about to become a death sentence in the most literal sense. The Pappenheimers couldn't know it yet, but their very existence had marked them as perfect victims for a horror beyond imagination. They were about to learn that in a world gripped by fear and superstition, being nobody meant you could be transformed into anybody's monster. But being shunned by society was one thing. Soon, their very existence would become a crime. Knock, knock, knock. For the Pappenheimer family, every sound from the outside world was a potential threat. By 1590, Bavaria had made poverty itself illegal. The wandering poor, the beggars, the families without permanent residence, they weren't just unwanted anymore, they were criminals. And the Pappenheimers, forever moving from town to town in search of work and survival, fell squarely into this category. Imagine the constant tension. Every time Paulus left their temporary shelter to find day labor, every time Anna ventured out with the children to beg for food, they were committing a crime punishable by imprisonment or worse. The sound of horses' hooves on cobblestones sent hearts racing. Was it just a merchant passing by, or was it the town guard? Now, you have to understand what desperation does to people. It makes them take risks that seem insane from the comfort of safety. One night, with the children crying from hunger, Paulus made a decision that would haunt the family forever. He heard about a job-steady work that paid actual wages. The catch? It was the worst job imaginable, cleaning privies. The waste handlers of Bavaria weren't just poor, they were the absolute bottom of society's ladder. They worked at night, moving through the darkness to empty the cesspits and privies of the townspeople. They literally handled human filth, and that filth clung to them in the minds of everyone they met. But it was work. It was survival. And this is where the family got their name, Pappenheimer. Not their real name, but a label, a brand that marked them as the lowest of the low. In some accounts, it came from the paper used in privies. In others, it was a corruption of a place name, but the origin doesn't matter as much as what it meant. You are filth. You handle filth. You are what you handle. Picture Anna's face when Paulus came home with the news. The relief at having steady income warring with the horror of what it meant. Their children would now carry this stigma too. Little Michel, barely old enough to understand, would grow up as the son of the Pappenheimer, the shit handler, the night crawler, the thing that decent people didn't acknowledge in daylight. The job meant they could settle in one place, at least temporarily. They found lodging, if you could call it that, in the worst part of town, where the smell from the tanneries mixed with the stench of poverty and desperation. But even this stability was an illusion, because now they weren't just outcasts. They were visible outcasts. They had a title, a role, a presence in the community that people could focus their disgust upon. The work itself was backbreaking and degrading. Paulus would leave as darkness fell, wrapping himself in rough cloth, carrying the tools of his trade. He'd move from house to house, estate to estate, descending into the pits where human waste accumulated. The sound of his shovel scraping against stone, the splash of filth being loaded into carts, these became the soundtrack of the family's nights. But here's what the historical records don't capture: the small moments of humanity in the midst of this degradation. Anna keeping the children quiet, so Paulus could sleep during the day. The family sharing their meager meals, finding joy in small things. A successful day of begging, a kind word from a stranger, the simple fact of being together. The children grew up marked by their father's profession. Other children threw stones, called them names that stung worse than any physical blow. Pappenheimer, Pappenheimer. The chant followed them everywhere. Simon, the eldest, learned to fight back. Gumprecht became quiet, withdrawn. Little Michel clung to his mother's skirts, not understanding why the world seemed so cruel. And through it all, the fear remained, because being a legal waste handler was barely better than being an illegal beggar. One missed tax payment, one complaint from a citizen, one night where Paulus was too sick to work, any of these could send them back to the roads, back to being criminals simply for existing. The family had traded one form of social death for another. They were now the official pariahs, the acknowledged untouchables. They had names, addresses, a place in the community. But that place was at the very bottom, in the darkness, handling the waste of their betters. They were now the official bogeymen of the town, working in the dark. They had no idea that a real monster was about to speak their name. It all started with a captured thief, a desperate man in a cell, willing to say anything to save his own skin. The year was 1600, and in a Munich prison, a condemned criminal faced his interrogators. He'd been caught red-handed, and execution loomed. But the authorities offered him a deal: give them information about other crimes, other criminals, and perhaps mercy might be found. The thief, whose name history barely records, began to talk. And talk. And talk. At first, his confessions were mundane. He named accomplices in robberies, pointed fingers at other thieves. But his interrogators wanted more. In an era where every misfortune was blamed on dark forces, they pressed him about witchcraft, about devil worship, about the murders of children that plagued parental nightmares. And that's when the thief spoke the name that would doom an entire family: Pappenheimer. The accusation he crafted was a masterpiece of grotesque invention. The Pappenheimers, he claimed, weren't just waste handlers. They were serial killers who stalked pregnant women. They murdered them for their unborn children. And here's where the lie became so monstrous it took on a life of its own. They used these unbaptized infants to create magical candles. Candles that, when lit, would render anyone who carried them invisible. Candles made from the rendered fat of innocent babies. Think about the diabolical genius of this lie. It combined every parent's worst nightmare with the superstitions of the age. It took a family already associated with filth and darkness and transformed them into something out of a nightmare. The waste handlers who worked in the night became monsters who hunted in the night. The interrogators leaned forward. This was exactly what they wanted to hear. Not because they necessarily believed it at first, but because it was so sensational, so horrifying, that it would justify anything they did next. The thief, sensing their interest, elaborated. The Pappenheimers had been doing this for years. Dozens of victims, maybe hundreds. They had a whole network of accomplices. They met with the devil himself. Now, you have to understand the psychology at work here. Bavaria in 1600 was a powder keg of religious tension and social anxiety. The Catholic counter-reformation was in full swing. Protestants and Catholics viewed each other with deep suspicion. Tales of witches and devil worshippers provided a common enemy, something everyone could unite against. And who better to fill that role than a family of outcasts that everyone already despised? The thief's confession spread through the authorities like wildfire. Here was the answer to every unexplained death, every missing person, every stillborn child. The Pappenheimers, of course. Those who handled the city's filth in darkness, who lived on the margins, who had always been somewhat less than human in the public eye. It made perfect, horrible sense. But here's the truly terrifying part. The accusation was so extreme, so detailed, so horrifying that it created its own credibility. Surely no one would make up something so grotesque. Surely there must be some truth to it. The very monstrousness of the lie became its own proof. The authorities didn't investigate. They didn't look for evidence. Why would they? They had a confession from a criminal who had nothing to gain by lying, or so they told themselves. They had a perfect set of suspects in the Pappenheimers, and most importantly, they had a crime so sensational that solving it would bring glory to everyone involved. Word began to spread beyond the prison walls, whispers in the market, hushed conversations in taverns. The story grew with each telling. The Pappenheimers weren't just killing pregnant women now, they were conducting satanic rituals. They weren't just making candles, they were selling them to an entire network of criminals and witches. The family that had been merely despised was transforming into something else entirely, Bavaria's greatest threat. And all the while, the Pappenheimer family continued their miserable existence, completely unaware that their names were being spoken in halls of power. Paulus still cleaned privies. Anna still struggled to feed her children. Simon, Gumprecht, and little Michel still faced the daily humiliations of their status. They had no idea that a condemned thief's desperate lie had just lit a fuse that would explode their world. The accusation was so monstrous, it created its own reality, and unfortunately for the Pappenheimers, it had just reached the ears of the most powerful man in Bavaria. As the Pappenheimer family was dragged from a squalid tavern in chains, a world away, A man in an opulent palace was looking for an example. Duke Maximilian I of Bavaria was a man with ambitions that stretched far beyond his borders. He wanted to be the champion of the Catholic counter-reformation, the defender of the faith, the ruler who would restore order to a chaotic world. But he had a problem. His subjects were restless, anxious, full of fears about witches and devils and the breakdown of social order. He needed something dramatic, something that would show his power and his piety in one decisive stroke. When the report about the Pappenheimers reached his desk, Maximilian must have seen it as a gift from God himself. Here was the perfect opportunity. A family of outcasts accused of the most heinous crimes imaginable. No powerful relatives to object, no social standing to complicate matters. Just a group of human refuse who could be transformed into a lesson for all Bavaria. The arrest happened at dawn. Picture the scene. Paulus stumbling from the tavern where the family had taken shelter, still groggy from exhaustion after a night of work. The thunder of boots on cobblestones. Soldiers in full armor, far more than necessary for arresting a family of beggars. The children's screams as they were dragged from their mother's arms. Anna fought them. Of course she did. The historical records note that she had to be subdued, that she cursed and spat and clawed like a wild animal. But what mother wouldn't, seeing armed men seizing her children? Little Michel, only 10 years old, clung to her skirts until a soldier pried him away. Gumprecht tried to run, but was caught within steps. Simon, the eldest, stood frozen, perhaps understanding better than the others that resistance was futile. The neighbours watched from windows and doorways. Some crossed themselves, others turned away, but nobody intervened. Who would dare? And more to the point, who would risk themselves for the Pappenheimers? They were arrested not as people but as symbols, and everyone understood that instinctively. Meanwhile, in his palace, Maximilian was already planning the show trial. This wouldn't be some quiet affair in a local court. This would be a spectacle, a demonstration of divine justice that would echo across Europe. He personally ordered that the best interrogators be brought in, that no expense be spared in extracting confessions. The guilt of the accused was never in question. The only question was how to make their guilt serve the greatest political purpose. Here's the cold calculation that sealed the family's fate. Maximilian needed them to be guilty of more than just murder. Simple killers wouldn't serve his purposes. He needed devil worshippers, a vast conspiracy, proof that Satan himself was moving against Bavaria, and that only the Duke's iron fist could protect the faithful. The Pappenheimers would be the stars of this morality play, whether they knew their lines or not. The family was separated immediately. This was standard procedure, but it served a darker purpose. Alone, terrified, each family member would be more vulnerable to what came next. Paulus was thrown into the men's prison, Anna into a cell barely large enough to lie down in. The children, and this detail should chill your blood, the children were housed with hardened criminals who were encouraged to terrify them with tales of what happened to witch spawn. The machine of justice began to grind, but justice had nothing to do with it. Letters flew between the palace and the prison. Maximilian wanted updates. He wanted confessions. He wanted names of accomplices. Most of all, he wanted a show that would demonstrate his power and piety to rivals and subjects alike. The Pappenheimers had ceased to be human beings the moment that thief spoke their name, but now they weren't even criminals in any real sense. They were props in a political theatre, their bodies soon to be the canvas on which Maximilian would write his message of authority and religious devotion. Think about the monstrous efficiency of it all. A family nobody would miss. Accusations so sensational they would capture public attention. A ruler who needed to demonstrate his power. The Pappenheimers stood at the intersection of all these forces, and they would be crushed by them. The Pappenheimers were no longer people. They were props in a gruesome play, and the script was about to be written on their bodies with instruments of torture. In the stone silence of the torture chamber, truth doesn't matter. The only thing that matters is making the pain stop. The interrogation of the Pappenheimer family began with what the authorities called showing the instruments. They brought each family member, one by one, into a stone chamber beneath the Munich prison. The walls were lined with devices designed by twisted minds for the sole purpose of creating unbearable agony. The rack, the thumb screws, the boots that crushed legs, the pincers that glowed red from the brazier. They started with Paulus. The logic was cold break the father, and the family would follow. They stripped him naked, shaved his body standard procedure to search for devil's marks, and then they began. First came the thumbscrews, tightened slowly until the bones began to crack. When he insisted on his innocence, they moved to the boots, wooden devices that compressed the legs until circulation stopped and tissue began to die. But Paulus held out. For hours, maybe even days, he maintained the truth. They were just a poor family. They had harmed no one. They knew nothing of magic or devils or murdered children. The interrogators, frustrated, decided to escalate. They brought in Anna. Now imagine Paulus, broken and bleeding, watching as they prepared to torture his wife. The interrogators knew exactly what they were doing. Physical pain has limits, but watching someone you love suffer, that breaks people in ways that no instrument can match. They positioned Anna where Paulus could see her face, could hear every sound she made. The historical records are deliberately vague about what exactly was done to Anna, but we know it was methodical, escalating, and designed to break not just her body, but her will. And more importantly, it was designed to break Paulus by proxy. Each scream from Anna was worse than any torture they could inflict on him directly. And this is where the confession began to take shape, not as truth, but as the only currency that might buy mercy. Paulus began to talk. Yes, they had killed. Yes, they had made candles from infant fat. The interrogators, finally getting what they wanted, pressed for details. How many had they killed? Where? When? How? The numbers that emerged were staggering. 400 children. 400. The absurdity of the number should have been proof of the confession's falseness. When would a family struggling to survive have time to murder 400 children? How would such a massive crime spree go unnoticed? But logic had no place in that stone chamber. The interrogators coached them, shaped their confessions into a narrative that fit the political needs of the moment. They needed specific details about satanic rituals, so the Pappenheimers provided them. They needed a conspiracy that justified widespread fear, so the Pappenheimers invented one. Each session added new layers to the fiction, new horrors that the family remembered when the pain became unbearable. Anna's confession was particularly detailed. Under torture, she admitted to flying through the night on a demonic fork, to grinding up the bones of infants for magical powders, to sexual congress with demons. The confession was so elaborate, so full of impossible details, that it reads today like the fever dream of a mind destroyed by pain. But in 1600, it was taken as gospel truth. The children were not spared. Even little Michel, just 10 years old, was subjected to mild torture. What that meant for a child, the records mercifully don't specify. But we know he too confessed, admitting to helping his parents, to participating in their supposed crimes. The sight of their parents broken and bleeding, the threats of what would happen to them, the isolation and terror, it all combined to make even the children complicit in writing this fiction of horror. By the end, the Pappenheimers had confessed to being monsters beyond imagination. They had agreed to every accusation, embellished every detail their torturers suggested, created a mythology of evil that would haunt Bavaria for generations. The confessions were written down, signed with hands that could barely hold a pen, sealed with the authority of pain and fear. The interrogators had what they wanted, a complete narrative of diabolical crime that justified everything that would come next. The Pappenheimers had been transformed from a poor family into the authors of their own destruction, their agony translated into the fiction that would kill them. They had confessed to being monsters, but the machine wasn't finished with them yet. Now, it demanded they feed it more victims. Imagine the ultimate corruption, being forced to destroy others just to earn a single moment of peace from your own agony. The interrogators weren't satisfied with just the Pappenheimer family. A conspiracy of 5 people wouldn't create the sensation Duke Maximilian needed. They needed a network, a web of evil that would justify widespread action and demonstrate the Duke's power to root out corruption. So they returned to that stone chamber with a new demand: names. Paulus lay on the floor of his cell, his legs useless from the boots, his hands mangled from the screws. The interrogator entered with a pitcher of water. Just water, but to a man who hadn't drunk in days, it might as well have been gold. The interrogator made the bargain explicit. 1 name, 1 sip. A name of an accomplice in their supposed crimes, and Paulus could wet his cracked lips. Think about that moment. The absolute degradation of being reduced to trading human lives for water. Paulus knew these people were innocent. He knew because he was innocent, because the entire confession was a fabrication born of agony, but his body screamed for relief, and his mind had been shattered by weeks of torture. The first name came out as barely a whisper, a neighbor who had once shown them kindness. The interrogator smiled, allowed a small sip, then demanded another name, and another, and another. Each name brought a moment's relief water, a loosening of bonds, a brief respite from active torture, but each name also added another link to the chain of destruction. Anna faced the same devil's bargain. They told her that Paulus had already named dozens of accomplices. Why protect people who were already doomed? Why suffer for those who would soon suffer anyway? And didn't she want to see her children again? Didn't she want their suffering to end? All she had to do was confirm the names Paulus had given and add some of her own. The children were manipulated differently. They were told their parents had confessed everything, that holding back names would only anger God further. Little Michel, confused and terrified, began naming everyone he could think of. The baker who had once given them stale bread, the tavern keeper who had let them shelter from rain, even other beggar children they had encountered on the roads. The interrogators carefully recorded every name. They cross-referenced, looking for patterns, building their case for a massive satanic conspiracy in the heart of Bavaria. When the Pappenheimers ran out of names they actually knew, the interrogators suggested some. What about the miller's wife? Didn't you say you saw her at a gathering? And the tortured family, desperate for any approval, any mercy, would agree. Yes, the miller's wife. Of course. By the time the naming ended, over 400 people had been implicated. 400 souls marked for investigation, interrogation, possibly torture and death, all because a desperate family had been forced to trade names for water, for a moment without pain, for the false promise that cooperation might save them. The virus of accusation spread outward from that torture chamber like ripples in a poisoned pond. Some of the named fled immediately, their flight taken as proof of guilt. Others were arrested, and under torture, they too began naming names. The fiction the Pappenheimers had been forced to create took on a life of its own, growing and mutating with each new victim. But here's the most heartbreaking part. The Pappenheimers knew what they had done. In their few moments of lucidity between torture sessions, they must have been haunted by the faces of those they had condemned. They had been transformed from victims into vectors of destruction, their pain weaponized against innocents just like themselves. The interrogators had succeeded beyond their wildest dreams. They had taken one family's agony and transformed it into a tool of mass persecution. The Pappenheimers had given them everything: confessions, details, names. The conspiracy Duke Maximilian wanted now existed on paper, signed and sealed, ready to be presented to the world. The machine of persecution was fully operational now, grinding through lives with bureaucratic efficiency. And, at its heart, were the Pappenheimers, broken and emptied, having served their purpose as the seeds of a manufactured panic. They gave up over 400 names, sealing the fates of countless others. The trial was a success. Now, all that was left was the public spectacle of their annihilation. The execution of Paulus Pappenheimer was not justice. It was a meticulously choreographed performance of sadism, designed for maximum public effect. July 29, 1600. Dawn broke over Munich with the sound of drums and church bells. This was not to be a simple execution. Duke Maximilian had ordered a spectacle that would be remembered for generations. Workers had spent days preparing the route from the prison to the execution grounds, setting up barriers to control the massive crowd expected to attend. The Pappenheimer family was awakened before dawn. They were washed, dressed in the white shirts of the condemned, and prepared for their final journey. But first, there was one more act of cruelty. The authorities brought them together one last time: Paulus, Anna, their adult son Simon, and the younger boys Gumprecht and Michel. They were allowed to see each other, to say goodbye, knowing that within hours they would die in front of tens of thousands. The procession began at 6 in the morning. Paulus was placed in a cart, his broken legs unable to support him. But this wasn't mercy, it was practicality. They needed him conscious and aware for what was to come. Anna and Simon walked, chains clanking with each step. The younger boys were carried by guards, their small bodies overwhelmed by the situation. Along the 2-mile route, the executioner's assistants had set up stations. At each one, a new torture was inflicted on Paulus as the crowd watched. First came the pincers, heated until they glowed red, tearing chunks of flesh from his arms and chest. The smell of burning meat filled the air. Paulus screamed, but the procession never stopped. This was theatre, and the show must go on. At the second station, they tore at his legs with the pincers. At the third, his back. Each wound was calculated to cause maximum pain without killing him. The executioner was a professional. He knew exactly how much the human body could endure. Between stations, priests walked alongside the cart, urging Paulus to repent, to embrace God before his death. The irony was lost on no one. They were torturing him in the name of the same God they demanded he embrace. The crowd's reaction was mixed. Some cheered each new torture, caught up in the bloodlust of the moment. Others watched in horrified silence, perhaps recognizing that this could be them, their families, if they ever fell afoul of the authorities. Children were held up on shoulders to see better, to learn what happened to those who consorted with the devil. Anna was forced to watch it all. This too was calculated. Her torture was psychological seeing. Her husband systematically destroyed, while knowing her own fate would be no better. Simon stood beside her, and the records note that he tried to comfort his mother, even as he faced his own death. The younger boys were kept slightly apart, but close enough to hear everything, to understand what was happening to their father. When they finally reached the execution ground, Paulus was more dead than alive, but the performance wasn't over. He was tied to a wheel, his broken body displayed for all to see. In a normal execution by breaking wheel, the condemned would receive a mercy blow to end their suffering quickly, but Paulus was denied even this small grace. He was left to die slowly, each breath a struggle, each moment an agony. The symbolism was clear. This man was so evil, so far beyond redemption, that he deserved no mercy. The crowd was meant to see and remember that Duke Maximilian's justice was absolute, that those who threatened the social and spiritual order would face suffering beyond imagination. As Paulus lingered on the wheel, gasping and moaning, the executioner prepared for the next act. Anna was brought forward, her eyes locked on her dying husband. The stakes were ready, the fires were lit. But first, there would be one more performance, one more calculated cruelty designed to burn itself into the memory of every witness. The execution of the Pappenheimer family was entering its final act, and the worst horrors were yet to come. Everything until now had been prologue. What happened next would ensure that the name Pappenheimer would echo through history as a synonym for judicial murder. Paulus was dead. The crowd roared, and then the executioner turned his gaze towards Anna, and what he did next was designed to shatter the very soul of her family. We return now to where we began. Anna Pappenheimer bound to the stake, the executioner's blade catching the morning sun. Her husband's broken body still visible on the wheel, a grotesque monument to the Duke's justice. Her sons watching with eyes that would never recover from this sight. The executioner didn't immediately light the pyre. First came the final degradation. As the crowd pressed forward, as her young sons Michel and Gumprecht were held fast by guards, the executioner tore open Anna's shirt. What happened next was an assault on motherhood itself, the symbolic destruction of the body that had nursed these children, that had been their first comfort in a cruel world. Her breasts were cut away, and the mutilated flesh was forced against her sons' mouths in a mockery of maternal nurturing. The crowd fell silent. Even in an age of public executions, this was shocking. This wasn't just killing. It was the deliberate annihilation of the sacred bond between mother and child. Michel, only 10 years old, would carry this image for the brief remainder of his life. Gumprecht's face, according to one witness, went blank, as if his mind simply refused to process what was happening. Only then did they light the fires. Anna Pappenheimer died not just as a condemned witch, but as a mother whose final moments were engineered to cause maximum trauma to her children. The flames rose. The crowd began to disperse, but the show wasn't over. Simon, the eldest son, was beheaded, a relatively merciful death compared to his parents. But mercy was relative in this orchestrated nightmare. He died, knowing his parents had been tortured to death, knowing his young brothers would follow, knowing that their family name would forever be synonymous with evil. The authorities saved a special fate for Michel. At 10 years old, he was too young to execute immediately, Even Duke Maximilian's justice had some limits. Instead, they subjected him to something arguably worse. He was forced to watch every moment of his family's destruction, guards ensuring he didn't look away. Officials carefully recorded his reactions, noting them down for posterity. After the executions, Michel was placed in the custody of Jesuits who would attempt to save his soul. He was rebaptized, given a new name, told daily that his parents were monsters who deserved their fate. For 3 months, this child lived in a purgatory of religious indoctrination and trauma. But the authorities had always intended to complete their destruction of the Pappenheimer line. On November 26, 1600, Michel was strangled and burned. A 10-year-old boy, murdered by the state for the crime of being born to the wrong family. Gumprecht met the same fate, though the records are less clear about exactly when. The Pappenheimer case sent ripples of fear throughout Bavaria. The 400 names extracted under torture led to dozens more arrests, more torture, more executions. Entire families fled rather than risk accusation. The social fabric of communities tore as neighbors wondered who might name them under torture. Duke Maximilian got what he wanted. He was celebrated as a defender of the faith, a ruler strong enough to root out evil. The Pappenheimer executions became legendary, cited as proof of the danger of witchcraft and the need for harsh measures. But here's what we must remember. The Pappenheimers were innocent. They were a poor family, guilty of nothing more than existing on the margins of society. Their true crime was being powerless when power needed victims. Their story isn't about witchcraft or justice. It's about how fear and politics can transform ordinary people into monsters and then destroy them for the monstrosity forced upon them. The name Pappenheimer lives on, but not as they would have wanted. It lives as a reminder that civilization is always just a few accusations away from barbarity, that justice without mercy becomes mere cruelty, and that the most dangerous magic is the spell that makes us see devils where there are only desperate human beings.